There was once a wetland, as there have been many on the planet for a very long time. Then humans came along and sentenced the wetland to being drained, dried out, filled, to becoming useful at last. On the equator in South America, French Guiana has not been spared this phenomenon. For dozens of years, and despite the appalling living conditions, slaves were sent to the core swamp to grow rice in this immense wetland close to the Brazilian border. With the end of slavery, the rice fields were returned to the wetland, and only a few signs of human determination remain. Nevertheless, in the heart of the wetland is a pond which has been totally ignored by the planners and developers. A sort of tiny paradise where life appears to flow along in a state of perfect harmony. It is here that some astonishing and rare inhabitants have chosen to live. Birds, reptiles and plants that exist nowhere else. A kind of sanctuary for rare species. This pond had never been penetrated by humans, and with good reason. It was once totally inaccessible, situated in the heart of an immense wetland of floating grass, itself surrounded on one side by impenetrable jungle and on the other by formidable mudflats. This totally unknown pond is about to reveal its most intimate secrets. One day, a mammal never before seen in the vicinity and accompanied by several fellow creatures arrived by the only possible route, the sky. A rare species too, scientists. Neither fish nor frogs, they established themselves in a sort of house placed on the water, which was soon to become a floating laboratory, sheltering numerous predators who were rather curious about, if not intrigued by, this intrusion. At the head of this small group, Daniel Giral, researcher at the Development Research Institute and specialist in aquatic ecology. Long intrigued by this pond, which he had previously only been able to fly over, Giral arrived with the firm intention of deciphering the strategies adopted by the inhabitants of this little paradise, which was about to reveal a world governed by a very subtle state of equilibrium and relying on laws of extraordinary ingenuity. Water is obviously the dominant element in this aquatic ecosystem, but where did it come from? In our conquest of the planet, we humans learnt to take advantage of the winds, particularly the trade winds that blow permanently in the same direction, leading directly from Europe and Africa to the Americas. These winds carry with them enormous clouds, the cumulonimbus, formed by the condensation of water evaporated from the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The trade winds converge on the east coast of the South American continent. The first barrier encountered by these masses of humid air is a hill barely 350 meters high on the coast of Guyana. Here, in an almost flat landscape, it is called Core Mountain. In fact, despite its low altitude, this hill does indeed play the role of a mountain by causing the brusque halt of the clouds and very intense equatorial rains.
We are now on the Core Mountain track, which leads over the pass at an altitude of 330 meters above sea level, in the zone with the highest rainfall in Guyana. Every year between 4 and 5 meters of waterfall here.
All very well. However, all this water that falls from the sky in an enormous quantity runs over ground that is practically devoid of soil, for the mountain is an immense metallic shell composed of iron oxide. The water carries nothing with it, and therefore none of the elements indispensable for the development of life. When the water reaches the base of the mountain, it is still rainwater, totally pure. This mountain is in fact the vestige of very ancient and immense volcanoes that were in activity before the separation of South America from Africa. Worn down and washed of all its soil, this enormous slab of highly compact iron is covered by a forest in a state of survival despite its appearance, since it grows in extremely poor soils and can rely only on its own litter for regeneration. The roots of these trees run along the surface and attempt to penetrate the shell in search of nutrients and water. The roots may extend for more than 100 meters without finding what they seek. This mountain is incapable of retaining rainwater, which pours into an immense basin over 70 kilometers long, spreading out over 40 kilometers as far as the ocean, the core wetland. The absolute purity and, more importantly, poverty of this water is not a good omen for the development of life in the wetland, since it contains no nutrients. The wetland is covered in floating vegetation, which prevents gaseous exchange between air and water, and moreover considerably limits the amount of light that can penetrate the water. Without light, photosynthesis is impossible, and thus there is no oxygen production in the water. In addition, the slow decomposition of the plant cover consumes the little oxygen that was dissolved in the water as it ran down from Core Mountain. This pond, a simple tear in the plant carpet, lacking in nutrients and oxygen, does not seem very favorable to supporting life. And yet, an astonishing fauna has obviously chosen to live here. How do all these inhabitants manage to coexist in this closed space, isolated in the heart of an immense flooded prairie? The water is not only poor in oxygen, it is acidic due to the decomposition of plant matter, one more obstacle to the development of life.
Come on. Right. So here I'm going to filter the water to retain all organisms bigger than 40 microns.
The scientist nevertheless manages to observe several very rare algae hidden in the decomposing organic matter. Nevertheless, it is algae that form the first link in the food chain. Under the microscope, they reveal all their beauty. They are veritable jewels. They are so few in number that their role is quite negligible compared with the water lilies that cover practically the entire surface of the water. These plants intercept most of the light and take up the little nitrogen and phosphorus available in the environment. Well then, how can a food chain like this function, culminating in such powerful predators as the black caiman and relying at the outset on such a low concentration of algae? In this very special water, Daniel has successfully demonstrated that microscopic aquatic life is present, although poorly developed. Yet several species of living organisms managed to survive in this biological near desert. The smallest organisms are the zooplankton, which, feeding on algae, usually constitute the second link in the food chain. The problem here is that the algae are not only very rare, but they are much bigger than the zooplankton, which consequently cannot eat them. Several other organisms, the rotifers, are also present in very small numbers. Here they are so small that they eat mostly bacteria, which they suck in using a clever system consisting of a double crown of cilia turning in opposite directions. In this amphibian world where plants dominate, even birds have had to adapt. Among the pond's residents, the jacana is a specialist in walking on unstable terrain. Supported by the lily pads, it is forced to move continually so as not to sink. However, having little gratitude for the plants that allow it to walk on the water, its behavior shows a lack of respect for the flowers of these water lilies. For this bird, considered to be an insect eater until this first observation, the nitrogen-rich seeds of the water lily constitute an indispensable dietary supplement in this very poor environment. A strange bird populates the sides of the pond, the hoatzin. It is so well adapted to this plant-dominated world that it has become a vegetarian. Looking like a living fossil, the bird eats leaves exclusively. The trees thus provide not only its perches, but its food as well. To be able to assimilate the leaves of the toxic and indigestible pterocarpus tree, which makes up the major part of its diet at the pond, the hoatzin has had to develop a digestive system that closely resembles that of ruminants. Very selective in its diet, it chooses exclusively the youngest leaves on the end of the branches, the least coarse, a perilous exercise in balance for this heavy bird. Its hypertrophied stomach, which accounts for 1/4 of its body weight, is responsible for the significant atrophy of its wing muscles. Jumping and gliding more than flying, its ability to move around is very limited, but without serious consequences. Indeed, what would be the point in being able to leave the pond when the pterocarpus grows only at the pond and nowhere else? In this chain of adaptation and behavior, it is now very difficult to determine whether the hoatzin became a leaf eater because it is a bad flyer, or whether its adaptations for digesting the leaves have imposed a sedentary lifestyle on the bird. Because of these now irreversible choices, the life of the hoatzin at the pond is completely dependent on the young trees that colonize the banks. This vegetation is regularly nibbled and produces a large amount of dead wood, which has some highly unexpected consequences. The little egrets that occupy the tops of the trees are birds with a much more classic diet. But this impoverished pond can offer no resources to its tenants. The scientists' observations indicate that it is a calm and isolated dormitory where it is possible to rest and reproduce in complete peace. Each morning, the colony of egrets takes off in extended order to fish in waters where the fish are both abundant and more accessible. All these observations only render the paradox of this pond more incomprehensible. The extreme poverty of the water is in total contradiction with the presence of super predators such as the black caiman. It is the scientist's curiosity that provides him with the first key to understanding. Between the wide lily pads, Daniel Giral has noted the presence in various parts of the pond of timid and fragile little yellow flowers that emerge from the surface of the water.
Can you see that? Just there, next to that lily pad? That delicate little flower there.
Still more surprising, these flowers are attached to very large yet invisible immersed vegetal masses. They present a highly complex organization with branches of a very bright green color spreading out below the surface of the water. And deeper down, very long brownish branches covered with small vesicles enveloped in a gelatinous substance. The contrast between the green surface branches and the brown deep branches, where you would expect to find roots, is remarkable.
These are not roots. So you can see all these little vesicles, these little transparent balls.
What is this plant then, since these are not roots and the plant floats freely on the water?
This is quite surprising. Inside you can see little prey, still alive, that have gone inside these sorts of traps. So here we're dealing with a carnivorous plant. It has a double function, that of a chlorophyllc plant, which explains these green branches, and it also feeds on living prey.
These carnivorous plants are called Utricularia, bladderworts. This aquatic plant has developed a quite astonishing strategy, task specialization. For its surface branches, the classic activity of photosynthesis, and for the deeper branches, the capture of living prey. Thanks to the zooplankton they capture, these carnivorous plants find the nitrogen and phosphorus indispensable to their survival, although these elements are practically absent in the water. Each sac-shaped trap has two big branching antennae which serve to direct the prey towards the valve that hermetically seals the trap. The capture is set off when the sensory hairs around the entrance to the trap are touched by the prey. This information leads to a reflex action that opens the valve. When the valve opens, water and prey are sucked in. followed immediately by the closure of the valve. These steps take only 10 to 15 thousandths of a second. However, the scientist has another question. How can this intense predatory activity be explained when the prey are so rare in the water? These carnivorous plants nevertheless remain plants and are immobile in stagnant water, unlike carnivorous animals that can track down their prey. What do they do to trap zooplankton? There are indeed some rare carnivorous land plants that also live in very poor environments. It is their odor or their color that attracts insects into their traps. But as for our wetland bladderworts, how can they be plants, carnivorous, and live permanently underwater at the same time? Only one solution. They must have a strategy for bringing the zooplankton close to the traps.
What interests me is describing the species. So the aim is to have the largest samples possible to get a good representation of the entire community living in this water in immediate proximity to the plants.
The researcher notes that in effect the concentration of zooplankton is much higher in the immediate vicinity of the carnivorous plant's traps than in the water of the pond. This concentration cannot be due to chance and must certainly be the result of a strategy established by the plant and directed at the zooplankton. On the branches of the plants and on the traps, Daniel notes the presence of fixed algae that are much smaller than those he observed under the microscope at the beginning of his mission. Tiny algae perfectly adapted this time to the size and diet of the zooplankton. The scientist then realizes that the plant allows itself to be colonized by algae in the sole aim of attracting zooplankton, to capture them as soon as they pass close to the traps. This behavior had never before been observed in this plant. Daniel now understands the meaning of the elevated concentration of zooplankton near carnivorous plants. It is logical. The zooplankton is there where it can find food, even if it is not without risk. The carnivorous bladderwort plants maintain a sort of kitchen garden, an exceptional strategy. It's exactly as if a lion cultivated a garden in the middle of the desert to attract and fatten up gazelles before eating them. What has never been seen in a desert on land exists here in the heart of the core wetland. As a result, this luxuriant kitchen garden and its inhabitants interest a whole range of curious fauna attracted by this godsend. Dragonfly larvae, which prowl around relentlessly in search of prey, and another very strange animal, the larvae of the caddisfly, which resembles a butterfly in the adult form. To protect itself from predators, this larva builds itself a case using secretions from its salivary glands. At the approach of this dragonfly larva, the caddisfly larva retreats inside its case and stops moving, an effective camouflage since the predator continues on its way, thus missing a prey of a size fitting its formidable appetite. The caddisfly larva, by eating the algae that develop on the branches of the carnivorous plant that have become too large for the zooplankton, thus ensures the regular maintenance of the kitchen garden. Another strange animal, the phylopod, also takes advantage of the abundant food in the bladderwort plants. This primitive pearly crustacean has feet with multiple functions. They undulate in a synchronized fashion for its respiration and to enable it to swim. The female shelters her young under her translucent shell. They are released only when their mother dies or molts. Look, a traveler has just landed. It's a Muscovy duck, and apparently it's interested in the pond. Almost immediately after landing, it starts poking around with its beak. It chooses our carnivorous plant. Is this a matter of chance? Probably not, since this selection represents a complete food, one which will satisfy all its needs. If this jousting match between two males for the attention of a female is any evidence, they seem to appreciate this sight, in spite of the more than menacing presence of caimans. But it is not just Muscovy ducks that are attracted to this pond for breeding. A new, quite extraordinary event is about to suddenly upset the fragile system. The arrival of new tenants, and not ones to be ignored. The scientist discovers that this sanctuary is not only one of the last places of refuge for the black caiman, but before his very eyes it is becoming the largest known breeding site in the world for an extremely rare bird, the agami heron. With his teammates, he witnesses the arrival en masse over a few days of these magnificent, poorly known birds that install themselves by the hundred in the trees bordering the pond. The ornithologists will count more than 5,000 of them.
We are really entering the sanctuary of the agami now. So here are these superb herons, and we have just about all the stages of development of the chick, the nest, the eggs. This really is quite a fabulous bird, and it is so rare that up to now we knew nothing about its ecology, its biology.
There begins immediately an above-water ballet under the watchful eyes of the caimans. The birds fetch small branches and build their nests. Where do they find this dead wood? On the trees, weakened by the constant nibbling of the hoatzins. Thanks to these leaf-eating birds resident throughout the year, the site offers enough dead wood for the construction of thousands of nests. Daniel Giral has just demonstrated a previously undocumented role of these birds. The hoatzins' nibbling has modified the environment and made it attractive to another species, the agami heron. Barely have the agami herons settled in when another heron species arrives in turn, the boatbill heron. However, to build its nest, the boatbill does not use dead wood. With its powerful beak, it breaks young leafy branches. The competition with the agamis is thus limited to the search for available space in the trees for establishing their nests. So a new question arises. What are these new immigrants and their chicks going to eat since this pond functions only through subtle exchanges, enabling the maximal utilization of the few available resources. The ornithologists who have come to join Daniel Giral are going to attempt to solve this riddle. The agami herons, the most numerous, are essentially nocturnal in their activities. During the day they take care of their nests, consolidating them, sitting on their eggs, defying each other. Not once do the scientists see them fishing in the wetlands. But at night, using infrared equipment, the ornithologists are going to observe the activities of this colony over several nights.
Look, there is one coming out and it's heading straight west. That one, straight west. And well, we're not getting anywhere with the figures, so obviously the birds must remain several days in the colony. This is all a bit strange. We were told that about 350 birds had entered, with a maximum between 8 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. Then it dwindles down. Towards 11 p.m. there's nothing much more. But they aren't going back and forth each day. It's not possible. We would see many more of them. It would be very surprising, really surprising, because in herons, especially with small herons like these, in general there's a daily feeding. Oh well, yes. One more question to resolve. But here I think we're on the right track.
The ornithologists will discover that each of the two parents in turn goes to sleep on a branch close to the nest. While the other leaves the pond for 2 to 3 days, returning to feed the chicks by regurgitation in the early morning, exhausted after having flown probably hundreds of kilometers. This previously undocumented behavior of the herons is also the confirmation that not one of the thousands of birds feeds in this pond, lacking in food resources. There are still more surprises for the scientists. A new colony establishes itself several weeks after the agamis and the boat builds. They are the American anhingas, whose reproduction had never before been observed in Guyana. The light brown females and the males with their superb black and white plumage build their nests together on the rare shrubs still available. These big birds, very skillful flyers turning about high in the sky with no apparent effort, also have webbed feet which enable them to swim and chase their prey under the water. Their webbed feet also have claws for a better grip on the branches. Equipment perfectly adapted to the daily lives of these formidable fish catchers who detect their prey from the sky. The ornithologists observe in these birds a behavior resembling that of the little egret. The anhingas regularly leave the pond to go and fish and return to feed their chicks by regurgitation. Space is starting to lack around the pond, which is decidedly a most popular breeding site. The trees are so fully occupied that territorial conflicts break out both within and between species. The colonies of little egrets, agami herons, boatbill herons and anhingas have caused a situation of overpopulation around the pond that was so tranquil just a few weeks before. It is quite obvious that the pond cannot feed the whole crowd. It is therefore for its absolute isolation and safety that these thousands of birds have chosen the site. No terrestrial predators, such as monkeys or iguanas, which would ravage the nests if they got to them, take the risk of venturing into this zone. The black caimans are the best guarantee of this safety. The powerful masters of the place, they circulate endlessly around the bases of the trees. Nevertheless, this constant surveillance implies the sacrifice of certain individuals. Mistakes are unforgivable. Falling from the nest is fatal. It is in a way the price to pay for this efficient surveillance. And beware the young heron that returns to the wrong nest from its first explorations, for the owner's punishment may be immediate. The small proportion of birds that fall from nests constitutes an important source of food for the caimans and partly compensates for the poverty of the pond. The arrival en masse of these migratory birds in the trees surrounding the pond is very likely to change the situation. The sudden integration of thousands of immigrants is never without consequence, whatever the society. These thousands of birds are going to produce an enormous quantity of droppings. This matter, known as guano, is a major fertilizer that contains all the building blocks necessary for life, and in particular the most essential, nitrogen and phosphorus. The importation of these elements changes completely the autarkic situation that once dictated how the pond functioned.
You have to approach really very quietly.
With these additional nutrients, will the pond emerge from its situation of extreme poverty?
So here we are going into the phosphorus zone. We're going to be able to verify this hypothesis about the bird's role in the overall functioning of this environment in terms of the contribution of the droppings of the adults as well as the chicks.
In the samples he has studied, the scientist notes that there is still very little life in the water, even though it now contains a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. All the nutrients fallen from the trees are useless because they are not usable. Indeed, it is the rainy season, and while the washing of the leaves and branches of the trees is intense, the over-dilution of the bird droppings and the absence of sunlight render their utilization by algae impossible. So nobody benefits from the manna, which remains desperately unusable, not even by the carnivorous plants, which in any case have no need. Their strategy enables them to live without nitrogen and phosphorus dissolved in the water. But the scientist remains perplexed. This sophisticated trapping technique does not sufficiently explain the healthy condition of the plants in this very poor environment. For, while the plant captures its prey using its traps, it nevertheless lacks a digestive system. The technique of digestion of this carnivorous plant remains totally unknown. How does it benefit from the zooplankton and appropriate the nitrogen and phosphorus? Daniel Giral is lucky, and it's a scientific first. Deep within the traps of living bladderworts and at very high magnification, he succeeds in observing an unsuspected activity. He discovers a considerable concentration of protozoa swimming inside the trap. At the junction of the head and body of a recently captured mosquito larva, a whole army has entered the breach and invaded the insect larva to digest it from the inside. The traps of the bladderwort shelter the protozoa, to which the carnivorous plant offers room and board. And so these feeble protozoa are able to feed on enormous prey that they would be unable to capture themselves. In return, while they eat, the nitrogen and phosphorus from the prey are dissolved in the water inside the trap. This water is then gradually excavated from the traps, enabling the vacuum necessary for a new capture to be re-established. The nitrogen and phosphorus are thus rejected to the exterior and are used both for the growth of the carnivorous plant, of course, but also to feed the algae that live fixed to the traps, making the traps a little more attractive to future prey. It's as if our lion, lost in its desert, recovered all its own excrement to improve the quality of the grass in its garden. The gazelles would become that much more appetizing and dependent. The scientist has just demonstrated a most astonishing adaptation strategy for dealing with a shortage of resources. In fact, it represents a situation of real symbiosis on a microscopic scale, and with shared advantages, associating two totally improbable protagonists, protozoa and an aquatic plant. This is all very well, but this complex organization that enables life despite the severe shortage of nutrients is about to tumble like a house of cards. It is even going to turn against the plant and cause its death. For the plant's strategy has meaning only in the context of shortage, but a new event is going to upset everything, the arrival of the dry season. The clouds are going to leave the area after several months of rain. The temperature and sunshine periods are at a maximum with very high values, for we are just above the equator. Due to the extreme evaporation, the pond will shrink and draw out all the water from the surrounding undergrowth, highly enriched by the bird droppings. The massive contribution of nitrogen and phosphorus from the droppings of thousands of herons during the wet season will now be used by the algae. Photosynthesis can at last begin in the waters of the pond. The algae will proliferate to such an extent that they soon form veils on the surface of the water. pond will thus pass from a state of extreme shortage to one of overabundant wealth. The algae that form long filaments are very different from the rare species present during the wet season and that now sleep at the bottom of the pond awaiting better conditions. This brutal passage from one state to another radically different state is very rare in the natural world. It cannot be without repercussions for the populations that live there permanently.
It's the famous carnivorous plant. So, completely covered in filamentous algae. It's going to be interesting to see how it's going to function when all its traps are completely blocked, stuck together with these filamentous algae.
The algae that our carnivorous plant maintains with parsimony for attracting prey will also proliferate, which will have an unexpected effect on the plant. Death by asphyxiation. Its traps are now so encumbered by the filamented algae that they can no longer detect anything. The algae now form an inextricable coating that the prey can neither penetrate nor eat, since the algae are too long. As a result, these algae are no longer attractive at all. The plant's death is inevitable since it has no way out. The algae keep the plant in total darkness. Impossible for the bladderwort to resort to a classical way of life through photosynthesis, which could pull it out of this bad patch. Even its green branches closest to the surface of the water are in permanent darkness. The plant's remarkable adaptation to a shortage of resources has turned against it completely and become a fatal trap. The plant suffocates, incapable of making use of the nutrients present in abundance in the water, because the entire aim of its adaptation was to be able to do without. But it's an ill wind that blows nobody good, and this profusion of algae and bacteria will constitute, after months of scarcity, an abundant food source for zooplankton, which will also proliferate. The zooplankton, now free from the predatory activity of the dying carnivorous plants, will be exploited by a new, equally hungry community, young fish. The evaporation and concentration of the water in the pond has attracted fish and caimans, which during the wet season had spread themselves throughout the wetland. It is now in this pond that the fish are going to breed. Thanks to the photosynthesis of the algae, the water is enriched in oxygen and the young fish are able to breathe. The migration of fish from all over the wetland to the pond, imposed by the drying out of the wetland, is followed by that of the caimans. Though extremely numerous, they will be assured of regular meals, and the former bird eaters will become fish eaters. Having grown sufficiently vigorous, when the next wet season arrives, the fish will leave with the overflowing water to populate the whole of the wetland. And this is the second fundamental role played by the pond. Whereas during the wet season the pond is a site of international importance for the nesting of very rare herons, during the dry season it enables the breeding of fish for the entire wetland. Even more surprising is the fact that these two functions cannot be dissociated one from the other, the link being the bird droppings, which are both a disruptive element for life in the pond and an organizational element for the entire core wetland. What can we learn from this ecosystem, totally untouched by humans? That, confronted with the situation of scarce resources, millions of years of evolution have seen the development of some extraordinary ruses that enable the tiniest photon, calorie, or organic molecule to be used optimally and as profitably as possible. Here, there is no such thing as waste. All these strategies have made it possible for life to establish itself through very different species, on the imperative condition that they undertake to exchange with each other. A remarkable but extremely fragile state of equilibrium has been set up. On the other hand, in a situation of plenty, only a few species can develop, to the detriment of the others. Is this pond not the reflection of human societies which, when poor, invent the most incredibly clever ways of existing, and, when rich, take for themselves all the energy in total contempt of those too well adapted to a situation of scarcity? Throughout the past decades, the slowly growing awareness of the importance of ecology has led to a complete reversal of the image of these formerly denigrated wetlands, which are now perceived as oases of biodiversity that it is more than urgent to conserve.